It was not a public scandal, a fiery speech, or an open rebellion that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Instead, the institution was shaken by the silent striking of a single name from a highly restricted document. The moment Princess Anne gave the directive to purge Camilla from the guest list for the sovereign's parade during these past days, the reverberations echoed through the royal residence like the heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding into place, its implications instantly transparent to those closest to the throne. Before we dissect the profound consequences of this move for the House of Windsor, take a moment to hit the subscribe button so you never miss our deep dives. Not a single word escaped Camilla's lips as the updated page was handed to her. Her gaze locked onto the document once, then lingeringly a second time, tracing the elegant typography where her attendance should have been set in stone. The sovereign's parade, an occasion where martial grandeur and majestic authority converge to project national allegiance to the crown, has never been a mere calendar event. To hold a spot on that roster is to receive official validation, to be positioned near its focal point signifies absolute reliance. Yet, within the boundaries where the queen consort expected her identity to be printed, there was nothing but a glaring void. Gazing out of the window, Charles remained frozen with the heavy posture of a man internalizing catastrophic updates before anyone possessed the nerve to voice them. The true weight of the situation was entirely clear to him. He recognized that this registry was far more than administrative paperwork, just as he recognized that and would never implement such a rewrite on a whim. For decades, the king had fought tirelessly to legitimize Camilla's standing by his side, transmuting their internal bond into a matter of state obligation. This solitary amendment, however, directly undermined the very legacy he sought to shield. His spouse had not been assigned a less prominent position, nor had she been instructed to make a separate entrance. She had been completely erased. Anne's decree bore the unyielding weight of a leader entirely conscious of the shockwaves she would trigger. The high-ranking courtier tasked with delivering the news offered no comforting euphemisms. A sudden bout of ill health was not the cause. A congested schedule was not the reason. Nor was this a strategic move by the administration to scale down the event's magnitude. The directive had originated directly from Anne's office, and the hushed tones of the messenger only amplified the gravity of the reality. As if sheer physical force could write her name back onto the protocol, Camilla gripped the parchment tighter. Charles demanded to know whose authority had sanctioned the final draft, but his inquiry withered into nothingness before filling the chamber. No figures stepped forward to reply, nor was there any necessity to do so. Anne's sovereign leverage had sliced through the bureaucracy with clinical accuracy. What caused the deepest panic was not the act of exclusion itself, but its typographic execution. No markers indicated a temporary status. No wording framed it as a fluid revision. It loomed on the page as an unyielding, permanent restructuring of the Royal Assembly. Detached, absolute, and uninviting. When Camilla eventually lowered the document, the enveloping quietude in the room grew suffocating. Charles shifted his eyes from the parchment to the aides surrounding him, clearly torn between his instincts as a protective partner and his obligations as a ruler who respected Anne's iron grip on state protocol. The onlookers in the chamber immediately recognized a devastating reality. This confrontation transcended a single military procession. It was an existential test of who retained the privilege to stand adjacent to the seat of power at a time when internal trust had grown dangerously thin. Yet, before the institution could fully process the motives behind Anne's decisive strike, it had to confront the brutal reality of who would bear the deepest scars. This omission of Camilla was far more significant than a shuffled seating chart. It struck at the core of personal pride, lineage, fidelity, and the volatile emotional framework of a new era still striving for equilibrium. For Camilla, it mirrored a humiliating public dismissal before the crowds had even assembled. For Anne, it represented a non-negotiable boundary of state duty. For Charles, it manifested as an intimate trauma that no crown could ever obscure. For several silent moments, Camilla sat motionless with the altered manuscript in her grasp, seemingly paralyzed by the reality staring back at her. She had spent a lifetime navigating state functions where every arrival sequence, every assigned share, and every meticulously planned stance broadcasted a specific message. Operating as queen consort, her perceived authority was entirely dependent on her visible proximity to the king. Within the sphere of the monarchy, exposure is never merely exposure, it functions as validation. It signifies legitimacy. It is the institution signaling to the populace who resides within the inner sanctum. On this occasion, however, that boundary had locked shut, leaving her on the outside. And had never belonged to the school of royalty that coated internal friction in diplomatic platitudes. She brandished her sense of obligation like a razor-sharp blade concealed within velvet, measured, silent, and impossible to deflect. Where her contemporaries hesitated over painful choices, and executed them without blinking. Where others sought cover behind panels of strategists, she anchored herself firmly to constitutional guidelines. This was precisely why her strike cut so deep. Camilla had not been pushed into the background, nor migrated to a lower profile slot, nor requested to arrive via alternative logistics. She had been excised altogether, a stark reality that rendered any institutional defense trivial in comparison to the insult. The impending fallout hit Charles before his wife could even utter a word. In a private exchange, he pressed in on whether a catastrophic misinterpretation had occurred, desperately searching for a loophole or a diplomatic phrase that could reframe the decision as an administrative error rather than an outright banishment. And, however, provided no path for retreat. She countered with the serene certainty of a strategist who had calculated the collateral damage and chosen to absorb it. The parade, she articulated unequivocally, could not serve as a theater for unresolved domestic rivalries. It could not allow personal grudges to taint a state ceremony anchored in sovereign prestige. The underlying threat in his sister's words left the king deeply shaken. The sovereign's parade was far from a routine gathering of elites, it stood as a visual manifesto of the constitutional hierarchy, where every individual granted a central spot reinforced the narrative of institutional cohesion. Should Camilla's presence divert public focus away from the crown and toward internal palace warfare, and believed the existential damage would solidify long before the initial salute was thrown, before the opening greetings were voiced, or before the eyes of the public ever locked onto the sovereign party. The underlying message was equally transparent to Camilla, which only served to make the sting more acute. To seasoned observers of royal dynamics, her non-attendance would never pass as an oversight. It would read as an intentional exile. It would signal a profound rift. It would project a condemnation delivered without a single microphone being raised. Lowering his voice, Charles demanded, "What planning meeting?" Beneath that solitary inquiry lay the specific historical flashpoint everyone had desperately sought to bury, the exact moment that converted a routine guest list into an institutional day of reckoning. Every institutional schism possesses a genesis point, yet this particular fracture did not manifest under public scrutiny. It erupted behind closed doors during a low-profile walkthrough briefing for the upcoming parade, the moment Camilla attempted to claim a level of institutional leverage she was never authorized to wield. Those present within the briefing room vividly recalled the suffocating stillness that followed, not because voices were raised, but precisely because Princess Anne refused to lose her composure. Charles had walked into that session operating under the assumption that it would be entirely ceremonial, the type of highly managed discussion where logistical minutiae are polished rather than contested. The atmosphere shifted instantly, however, when Camilla began lobbying for her structural role within the royal delegation to be heavily fortified. The sovereign's parade, a rigid martial exhibition where the physical presence of the dynasty symbolizes national stability, allegiance, and the undisputed power of the throne, carried immense geopolitical weight far beyond a standard public appearance. Spatial positioning was paramount because it broadcasted to the populace exactly who held the monarch's ultimate trust. For this reason, every single seat, every arrival sequence, and every name on the protocol carried an undercurrent of silent power. Camilla was acutely aware of that leverage, and she intended for it to be visible to all. She asserted that her alignment alongside Charles required explicit visual reinforcement, rather than being diluted or obscured by vague administrative phrasing. The Queen Consort had spent decades navigating public condemnation, and within that briefing room, her demands carried the raw exhaustion of a figure desperate to prove her institutional legitimacy. Yet, the further she pushed her agenda, the deeper Anne retreated into an icy silence. The Princess Royal offered no interruptions, nor did she rush to counter the arguments, she merely observed, and that terrifying self-control rendered the room far more volatile than any screaming match ever could. When Anne finally set her fountain pen down with slow, deliberate finality, everyone in attendance understood that the boundary of acceptable debate had been breached. She looked at Camilla and stated flatly that the procession was not a vehicle for personal rehabilitation. State protocol, she maintained, could never be bent to pacify individual self-doubt. The wording struck with brutal force because it transformed a structural disagreement into an intensely intimate critique. Caught in the crossfire between his sibling and his spouse, Charles looked from one woman to the other, paralyzed between emotional allegiance and sovereign duty, fully aware that both individuals genuinely believed they were protecting the monarchy through opposing philosophies. Though Camilla's expression hardened, she refused to back down, suggesting that Anne's logistical layout felt unnecessarily vindictive. That specific comment served as the fuse everyone would later pinpoint. Without a word, Anne closed the portfolio. No grand monologues followed, nor were any concessions put on the table. The briefing concluded with the species of tranquility that feels infinitely more ominous than an explosion of rage. It was in that exact window that the king realized his sister had finalized her internal verdict long before anyone else possessed the fortitude to articulate it. Anne exited the chamber with the portfolio tucked securely under her arm, leaving a heavy, suffocating atmosphere in her wake. Camilla had attempted to cement an unyielding position adjacent to the king, but her actions had instead illuminated a vulnerability that Anne believed had no place near a state ritual. A few days later, that identical portfolio would reappear with a single identity missing from its pages, accompanied by no apologies whatsoever. The moment the threshold of that rehearsal studio was crossed, an open confrontation became entirely inevitable. It merely required the appropriate setting to ignite. The ensuing clash did not unfold within the grand architecture of a throne room, nor in front of assembled media lenses, nor beneath state chandeliers designed for historical drama. It materialized within a secluded corridor where footsteps echoed faster than confidences could be kept, and where human expressions unveiled what structural titles desperately attempted to camouflage. An explanation was what Camilla sought, but Anne had already provided her final word. Standing between them, Charles recognized too late that neutrality could no longer shield anyone. Camilla advanced toward Anne with the revised document still clenched in her hand, the parchment appearing to carry a weight far heavier than any crown jewel she had ever displayed. The erasure had already dealt a massive blow to her self-esteem, but now it demanded an active voice. She demanded to know if public debasement had now become standardized palace doctrine, her words slicing through the hallway with the raw energy of an individual who had spent far too long suppressing humiliation. This crisis was not merely about being excluded from a singular event. It carried immense weight because the sovereign's parade represented one of those rare constitutional milestones where physical attendance signaled reality far beyond mere presence. It signaled to the royal household, the armed forces, and the global audience exactly who retained an unshakable position of trust near the throne. Before the dispute could deteriorate to a point beyond diplomatic repair, Charles stepped into the fray. He had trailed after Camilla because he understood that the organizational damage would multiply exponentially if the household staff overheard hostility echoing through private quarters. The king craved stability. He sought the diplomatic space required to soften the edge of Anne's blade, to reframe an open laceration as a mere logistical misunderstanding, protecting his spouse without openly micromanaging his sister. Anne, however, refused to offer him an easy exit. Standing her ground with cold, articulate precision, she informed Camilla that state pageantry could never be utilized to patch up private reputations. Camilla refused to absorb the declaration passively. Shifting her gaze from Anne to Charles, she scanned for emotional validation but encountered nothing but paralyzing ambivalence. The queen consort had endured years of warfare to be recognized as an intrinsic component of the institution's future, rather than a controversial relic of its past. Now, the very architecture she had bled to enter appeared to be consolidating against her. Anne's retaliation amplified that agony precisely because it lacked emotional heat. It was utterly systematic, sounding less like an outburst of anger and more like an unappealable verdict. Though Charles attempted to intervene once more, Anne locked her gaze onto him with the immovable force of a commander who had already crossed the Rubicon. She informed him flatly that the throne could not survive another high-profile appearance overshadowed by domestic warfare. The statement pierced him deeply because it transcended a simple grievance. It was an ultimatum. And was illuminating the reality that Camilla's inclusion in the procession would not project stability. Instead, it would drag public attention toward internal fractures, toward media gossip, and toward every buried trauma the palace had tried to mask beneath immaculate choreography. The tone of Camilla's voice shifted dramatically when she demanded to know if Charles had personally authorized the purge. That inquiry carried a lethal danger far beyond an accusation because it forced an absolute choice: husband or monarch, personal protector or guardian of the constitutional order. Charles opened his mouth to reply, but a suffocating hesitation preceded his words, and that very delay became the definitive answer everyone dreaded. Camilla decoded it instantly, as did Anne. His silence had compromised his position long before his vocabulary could attempt a rescue. And did not press her advantage any further. There was no structural need to do so. The directive had already achieved its strategic objective, and the hallway had laid bare what the guest roster had merely implied. As Anne walked away down the corridor, she left Charles to face Camilla in total isolation, the air between them thick with everything neither individual could dare to voice. He had not personally expunged her name, yet he had lacked the leverage to reinstate it. She had not merely lost a prominent seat, she had lost her institutional certainty. However, Anne's supreme leverage did not originate solely from biting phrases exchanged in a secluded hallway. It was anchored in a systemic power that Camilla had fatally underestimated. The court had always been aware of Anne's capacity for unyielding firmness, but this specific flashpoint exposed a layer far more formidable than mere temperament. She possessed a flawless mastery of the rulebook. She understood the internal gears of the machinery. She could pilot her way through the ancient, labyrinthine architecture of state ritual with a level of confidence that rendered any resistance look completely self-destructive. Camilla had merely picked a fight over a guest list, and had responded by dropping the entire weight of the crown itself. Charles required no briefing to comprehend why his sister's strike possessed such devastating leverage, yet he found himself analyzing the dossier as if the text might miraculously reveal a gentler reality. A high-ranking court official stood a few paces away, tracking the monarch's facial expressions as they migrated from flashpoints of annoyance to a far heavier state of mind, something bordering on a grim, reluctant surrender to the facts. Anne's institutional capital had not materialized out of thin air. It was the product of decades of unremitting duty, flawless discipline, and a deep-seated command of state ritual that no contemporary public relations strategist could replicate. She understood the anatomy of the monarchy because she had occupied its core, protected its boundaries, and witnessed the wreckage that ensues when individual desires attempt to bend constitutional protocol. The guest list for the sovereign's parade was a far cry from a simple attendance sheet. It operated as a highly calibrated manifesto detailing exactly who belonged within the ritualistic core of the state, a rigid blueprint informing the household, the military apparatus, and the general public who remained within the inner circle of trust. Charles was fully aware of this reality, and that awareness made the file in front of him almost impossible to overrule. Were he to reverse Anne's directive too aggressively, he would not merely be validating Camilla, he would be exposing a massive structural crack in the very facade designed to project absolute cohesion. A hidden domestic wound would instantly transform into a glaring public contradiction. The restructuring executed by Anne was far more cold-blooded than Charles had anticipated. She had not simply whited out Camilla's name and left an awkward gap on the parchment. Instead, she had entirely recalibrated the surrounding positions, compressed the hierarchy, and re-engineered the layout so that the omission appeared entirely intentional, highly structural, and permanent. That level of calculated precision rattled the king far more than a sudden burst of anger ever would have. Effusions of anger could be managed and de-escalated, but clinical precision demanded a structural counter-strategy, and the king realized with intensifying anxiety that his sister had anticipated his pushback long before anyone possessed the audacity to mount it. Discovering the confidential memorandum pinned to the dossier, Charles paused his reading for a brief moment before zeroing in on the sentence that carried the true weight of the document. The procession, Anne had typed, must move forward without domestic friction impacting the representation of the sovereign. On the surface, those words contained no overt malice, yet they reverberated with the finality of a court judgment. Anne was refraining from attacking Camilla directly, she was executing a far more lethal strategy. She was mapping out the institutional threat and prioritizing state obligation over personal empathy, constitutional order over individual comfort, and ancient ritual over one woman's desperate need for public validation. Long before Charles had scanned the final sentences of the document, Camilla had already begun absorbing the structural fallout. She recognized that she had been completely outmaneuvered days before the weekly pageantry was even set to commence. The queen consort had anticipated a standard bureaucratic skirmish, perhaps even a closed-door concession from the family, but had seamlessly woven the exclusion into the official administrative framework itself. Charles eventually closed the file without offering a single comment. In that heavy vacuum, every individual present understood that the gears of the palace had prioritized structural preservation over human emotion. And the moment the institutional apparatus ratified Anne's directive, the shockwaves migrated from private quarters into every vital artery surrounding the throne. Domestic fallout rarely manifests with theatrical screaming. Frequently, its inception is marked by a door that remains locked, a secure line that goes unanswered, or a chair systematically extracted from a briefing room where an individual fully expected to take their place. For Camilla, the opening manifestation of this rewritten reality arrived with devastating transparency. The logistical countdown pushed forward without her involvement, and not a single official made an effort to rectify the situation. Walking into the briefing room, Camilla fully expected the traditional momentum of state ritual to bend back in her favor. She assumed there would be an agenda portfolio waiting for her, a folder clearly labeled with her attendance itineraries, and a designated space arranged for the queen consort, as if the previous confrontation had been nothing more than a passing cloud. Instead, the boardroom table had already moved on without her. The countdown for the Sovereign's parade was currently being executed under the framework of the updated assembly, a critical shift because once a state ritual enters its terminal operational phase, modifications cease to be treated as negotiable ideas and solidify into unyielding facts. Anne's directive had not been negotiated into a compromise, it had been integrated into reality. The absolute silence inside the chamber inflicted a deeper wound than any verbal assault. The staff had been issued strict instructions to execute their duties without acknowledging the structural alteration to any external parties, and that mechanical discipline generated its own distinct brand of psychological cruelty. No officials attempted to correct Camilla because, within the new framework, there was absolutely nothing left to rectify. No one moved toward her with urgency because no data existed that authorized them to salvage her position. She internalized the exile long before anyone offered an administrative briefing. Her personal portfolio had vanished. Her assigned seat had been reallocated. The machinery of the state was surging forward, and she had been completely stripped from its gears. When Camilla questioned a mid-level aide regarding the whereabouts of her logistical packets, the agonizing delay that preceded the reply became the ultimate answer. It lasted for a mere matter of seconds, yet within that brief window of time resided the unvarnished reality of her downgraded status. The courtier did not offer an insult, nor did they display outright insubordination, they merely hesitated just long enough for the queen consort to internalize the fact that Anne's directive had traveled infinitely further than a private domestic dispute. It had successfully infiltrated the administrative desks, the tactical briefings, the master timetables, and the psychological framework of a staff trained never to betray an emotion. The king discovered shortly thereafter that the definitive operational briefing had already been locked in without a single line of Camilla's attendance notes included in the text. That specific detail rattled him far more profoundly than he anticipated. A private domestic argument could still be managed through back channels, and a public administrative correction could still be spun by media teams, but a finalized operational brief that completely excluded his wife signified that the apparatus of the state had committed to a definitive trajectory. The king could feel the institutional walls closing in around him, transforming a fractured family dispute into an unyielding constitutional reality. He had attempted to buy time, and had weaponized administrative procedure. William was the next figure to be discreetly brought into the loop, and his calculated stance carried its own chilling message. The prince manifested zero signs of disbelief, nor did he demand an immediate investigation into the matter. He merely paused, analyzing and maintaining absolute self-control, as though the update merely validated a structural crisis he had long anticipated. Charles monitored that emotional restraint with intense focus, because a vacuum of communication from William was rarely devoid of intent. It almost always signaled that an unappealable judgment was solidifying behind his eyes. Ultimately, Charles questioned whether Anne had pushed the boundaries of her authority too aggressively, but the inquiry failed to find the political traction he desired. William selected his vocabulary with extreme calculation, fully aware that a single unmeasured syllable could convert an intimate family trauma into an all-out civil war over the future of the dynasty itself. Within that heavy, deliberate pause, the realization hit the king that his son was no longer focusing merely on Camilla's empty chair. He was actively calculating what the institution would degenerate into if personal wounds were permitted to continuously dictate the execution of public duty. The moment William crossed the threshold of that private debate, the crisis ceased to be a mere territorial war between Anne and Camilla. It transformed into a battle for the very survival of the monarchy. The ultimate climax of the crisis unfolded entirely devoid of bureaucratic aids, official documents, or intermediate figures to sugarcoat the reality. Charles and William stood face to face within a secluded study, father and heir confronting an institutional crossroads that neither could downplay as a mere matter of administrative procedure. Anne may have been the individual who expunged Camilla from a parade roster, but William grasped the far deeper constitutional question: would the crown prioritize personal feelings, or would it defend institutional public trust? The king gazed at his son with the profound exhaustion of a man bearing the weight of two conflicting loyalties that refused to coexist in harmony. He did not formulate his inquiry from the position of a monarch first, he spoke as a vulnerable partner. He craved William's unvarnished perspective, but he was simultaneously hunting for an escape hatch, a delicate diplomatic maneuver that could successfully reinstate Camilla without publicly degrading and or escalating the weekly pageantry into an all-out royal standoff. The prince identified the systemic trap immediately. Were the exclusion to be rescinded too abruptly, the crown would fail to project mercy. Instead, it would project a fatal internal division. It would broadcast the message that state protocol could be bent and manipulated by domestic leverage. Once Anne had publicly established the boundary line, William recognized that his aunt's institutional weight could not be eroded without destabilizing the whole matrix. Anne had operated strictly within the boundaries of ceremonial law, a reality of immense consequence because the stability of the royal order depends entirely on the principle that certain institutional decrees remain unshakable once they are finalized. The sovereign's parade was a far cry from a private family gathering where bruised egos could be patched up with a quiet, backroom apology. It stood as a massive public manifestation of iron discipline, loyalty, and supreme command. Should Charles choose to override Anne's directive based on emotional impulses, the palace would inadvertently broadcast a highly dangerous signal to the nation that private discomfort possessed the power to outrank institutional trust. When Charles spoke openly of the intense pain Camilla was enduring, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted, feeling less like a majestic command center and more like a family trapped within the machinery of their own history. He articulated that she would never view this move as a matter of institutional discipline. She would interpret it as an absolute, final rejection. William did not minimize that psychological trauma. He was fully aware that the queen consort would internalize the exclusion with immense bitterness, and he recognized that no amount of sterile administrative wording could ever mask the reality of what an erasure meant. Yet, his response arrived with the steady, unyielding weight of a future sovereign. Public obligation, he informed Charles calmly, occasionally demanded that private suffering remain entirely hidden from view. The words cut deeper precisely because they lacked malice, they were undeniably true. William then laid bare the reality that the loyalty of the household staff had already locked in behind Anne's strategic interpretation of events. She had executed her move before the internal friction could inflict structural damage upon the event itself, long before media whispers could morph into open institutional embarrassment, and before the dynasty appeared to be managing human emotions rather than executing supreme command. Charles heard the implicit ultimatum embedded within his son's self-control. To reinstate Camilla at this stage would fail to patch up the wound, it would instead rip it open for the entire world to see. William exited the study without a single hint of personal triumph, leaving Charles isolated with the exact brand of silence he had spent a lifetime dreading. He refrained from picking up the secure line to Anne. He declined to execute a counterorder. He permitted the directive to stand unbent, and through that definitive failure to intervene, the final trajectory of the entire week crystallized into stone. By that stage of the crisis, the administration retained the capacity to manage the internal data, but they were completely powerless to suppress its underlying meaning, and the external world began to decode the wall of silence. By the following morning, the reality of the situation had broken through the barrier of the palace walls. It had ceased to exist as a classified administrative revision, a hostile confrontation between high-ranking royals, or a secure list sitting on a mahogany desk. It had transformed into a visual narrative that the general populace could instantly decipher, Princess Anne standing like an immovable pillar, Camilla nowhere to be seen, and the institution openly prioritizing systemic order over domestic emotional triage. Camilla discovered with brutal speed that an institutional void can travel with infinitely greater velocity than any carefully constructed press release. The Sovereign's Parade, a state ritual where one's physical presence serves as an explicit indicator of national fidelity, hierarchical status, and intimate proximity to the throne, had suddenly been thrust into the absolute epicenter of the media landscape. Because her name was glaringly absent from the official protocol during these days, media spokespersons attempted to keep their public declarations as narrow and sterile as possible. They utilized phrases detailing logistics, long-term planning, and the paramount necessity for operational focus, yet that administrative restraint failed to shield her. The void itself resonated infinitely louder than any press strategy designed to explain it away, and every managed phrase only served to make the trauma feel entirely intentional. In total isolation, Camilla monitored the media onslaught, keeping her facial expression entirely unreadable with the specific brand of psychological armor that institutional life demands from those already bleeding internally. She identified the existential threat instantly. The general public was not analyzing a sudden medical emergency, a calendar conflict, or a minor administrative reshuffling. They were looking at a deliberate manifestation of power. They were witnessing Anne's executive directive standing completely unchallenged. The Queen Consort had craved maximum visibility alongside Charles. Irony of ironies, her total invisibility now wielded an administrative force far greater than any public appearance could have ever mustered. That was the most savage twist of the knife. Her very exclusion had become the headline. And reviewed the morning publications completely devoid of any personal satisfaction. She did not indulge in celebration, nor did she soften her posture. The Princess Royal was acutely aware that achieving a strategic victory within the boundaries of a family can frequently taste exactly like a devastating loss. Her executive action had successfully insulated the constitutional order, but it had simultaneously exposed a deep-seated trauma. The front page of a prominent national publication captured the entirety of the structural schism within a single, brutal layout of text. A photograph of Anne in full military dress loomed next to the stark headline, "Parade line drawn," while a significantly smaller archival image of Camilla from a previous state event was positioned beneath it. The nation required no comprehensive briefing, the layout told them everything they needed to know. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, a modest assembly of citizens began to form. They were not screaming, nor were they brandishing political banners. Instead, they were constantly scanning updates on their mobile screens, exchanging observations in the strange, hushed tones that materialize when the public senses the gears of history shifting. A few individuals questioned whether Anne's strike had been excessively ruthless, others whispered that she had finally possessed the fortitude to execute the hard choice that everyone else had actively avoided. That public discourse was critical, because collective societal sentiment has a history of locking palace options into place. Once a nation begins to interpret an institutional silence as a moral verdict, even the reigning monarch loses the leverage to rewrite the underlying script. Charles confronted that reality with agonizing lucidity. He possessed the option to attack the media narrative through emotional outbursts and risk widening the institutional crack further, or he could accept the reality that the directive had already etched into stone. Camilla's non-attendance had expanded far beyond a private domestic injury. Anne's unyielding stance had solidified into a monument of public symbolism. William's calculating restraint had mapped out the future trajectory of the throne itself. And when the media static eventually dissolved, what remained in the vacuum was not a trashy tabloid scandal, but an unyielding historical judgment, the specific brand that only time delivers long after the screaming has died down. When the curtain fell, the most devastating statement delivered at the Sovereign's Parade was not articulated from a royal podium, printed within an official state bulletin, or whispered into a journalist's ear by an anonymous court strategist. It manifested as nothing more than an empty space on the pavement where Camilla had fully intended to stand. Princess Anne's executive strike had accomplished far more than the erasure of a name. It had drawn an unyielding constitutional boundary line, and every individual orbiting the throne understood with absolute clarity what had structurally shifted. Camilla remained locked away from the cameras, yet her non-attendance infiltrated the ritual long before any official spokesperson could attempt to explain it away. The sovereign's parade, that rigid matrix of military pageantry where constitutional stability and absolute allegiance to the crown are manifested through a meticulously orchestrated hierarchy of presence, surged forward with the updated roster entirely uncompromised. This detail carried immense historical weight because the institution had successfully absorbed intense private lobbying, emotional breakdowns, and a global media storm. Yet, despite the chaos, and strategic architecture survived intact. The queen consort no longer possessed the political leverage to reframe her exclusion as an administrative blunder or a scheduling oversight. Her empty spot had successfully become the definitive message. Charles observed the unfolding pageantry with the heavy, restrained posture of a commander who had lost the defining battle of his household without ever raising his voice. The king carried two distinct lacerations simultaneously: the profound grief of a partner incapable of reversing the trauma inflicted upon his wife, and the non-negotiable obligation of a ruler who could not ignore the systemic reasons why the directive had been permitted to stand. He recognized that the House of Windsor had presented a flawless, highly managed facade to the world. Yet, beneath that serene surface lay an unyielding internal verdict: the integrity of state ritual must be insulated at all costs, even when intimate human relationships are ground to powder in the process. And felt zero necessity to articulate her motives a second time. She had already delivered her manifesto through direct action, and that action grew increasingly unassailable because it refused to buckle under pressure. The Princess Royal had successfully demonstrated a fundamental law that the court rarely voices out loud: proximity to the crown is never guaranteed by marital status, human emotion, or personal expectation. It must be actively reinforced by institutional trust. This was the precise reason why her move carried such immense historical force. She had not simply locked Camilla out of a singular afternoon event, she had drawn an iron perimeter around the sanctity of the state ritual itself and forced every other player in the matrix to bow to its authority. The absolute silence maintained by William validated a reality that Charles could no longer escape. The heir had flatly declined to lobby for a reversal, and that cold restraint illuminated the future anatomy of the monarchy far more lucidly than any constitutional manifesto ever could. He recognized that fragile domestic compromises might temporarily pacify the present moment, but they possessed a hidden capacity to structurally weaken the very institution waiting for him on the horizon. The future sovereign prioritized institutional discipline over domestic comfort, absolute clarity over emotional damage control, and systemic confidence over administrative confusion. In executing that strategy, he left Camilla structurally isolated, but he left the crown infinitely steadier on its foundations. The definitive psychological verdict was impossible to soften. And systematic erasure of Camilla from the parade registry marked the precise historical intersection where private domestic distress surrendered unconditionally to public constitutional order. Camilla surrendered her position at a singular military ritual, but the monarchy successfully extracted a razor-sharp perimeter around what state duty demands. Charles was left internally isolated and stood entirely vindicated. William emerged significantly more secure in his position. And the crown itself materialized from the storm colder, yet infinitely more defined. Consequently, the procession concluded not with a tidy domestic reconciliation, but with a structural truth that no figure within the palace walls could dare to challenge. Within the historic House of Windsor, an empty space can speak with the force of thunder.